Okay, guys, we're going to continue the lesson from where I left off the other day. So make sure everyone here is taking notes since this will not be repeated tomorrow, hopefully tomorrow when I return. Okay, so let's just quickly go back and review what we had left off from yesterday. I had mentioned here what these four things have in common: the farmer's market, Walmart, the New York Stock Exchange, and the Penny Saver ad. Basically, what they have in common is that there is a market involved, that they're all in some type of a form, some kind of market. And basically, people at the market come to exchange some kind of payment for goods or services. So, for example, the farmer's market, people are coming to buy fruits and vegetables. If you go to Walmart, it's usually for consumer goods. The New York Stock Exchange is going to be for stocks and bonds. And then the Penny Saver ad would be things for like used goods and random services. So all these have basically this idea of a market system in common. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. All right. So let me explain how a market economy is actually organized. Now, I've mentioned before with traditional economic systems and command economic systems that there are the four basic economic questions. And depending on the economic system, those four economic questions are answered differently. In the case of a market economy, those basic economic questions are answered by what I have here, the exchange of buyers and sellers. So there is no central planning agency. There is no tradition being used. There's no trial and error system. Essentially, the questions of what to produce and how much to produce and how to produce it and for whom, all those questions are essentially answered through this natural exchange that takes place between buyers and sellers. So this is going to be the most basic, most fundamental concept that we're going to be repeating over and over again that many of you guys have probably already heard about for economics. So there's an interaction of two components. Basically, we have supply. The definition of supply in your book is what you see here: the quantity of a good or service that a producer will provide at each of its possible prices. And then there's demand: the quantity of a product consumers want at each of its possible prices. So you'll notice, basically, supply and demand, I mean, everyone knows what that means, but to be more specific, supply is pertaining to the producer side, okay, the side that will be producing the good or the service. So supply is about that side. Demand is going to describe the consumer side, the side that's the people that are trying to buy the goods or services. So the interaction taking place between buyers and sellers, again, the supply would represent the sellers, the demand would represent the buyers. That exchange taking place, the interaction between supply and demand, is what's going to dictate the answers for the four basic economic questions. Now, the guiding principle of market systems is self-interest, and what that basically means is what will start to allow a market economic system to operate on its own is the idea is that both sides, the supply side, the demand side, basically the side of the sellers and the side of the buyers, will all be motivated through self-interest. Okay, self-interest basically is greed. And that's actually a key component. The word greed sounds bad. There's a video I'm going to show you guys later that kind of debates this idea of whether greed is actually a good thing or a bad thing. But nevertheless, that we use the term self-interest more frequently to describe the guiding principle rather than using the word greed, but they're essentially the same. Buyers are greedy. They want to find the best buy for for the money that they have. When they're looking for a product, a good or service, they're looking for the best buy, and so they want to get something the best quality at the lowest price. And essentially, it's to look out for themselves. It's a self-interest issue. Sellers, likewise, are trying to sell products, the most products at the lowest, at the highest possible price, so that they can make a profit. So sellers are also interested in only themselves, and even though the two components that are interacting seem to contradict one another, because the interests are directed towards themselves, for some reason that interaction works in a market economy, and it allows for us to be able to address those four economic questions. So the official name or term for our market economy is called capitalism, where basically it describes a market system where you have private individuals owning most of the resources, most of the industries. So here in the United States, we are largely a capitalistic country, and so as a result, most of our resources and most of our industries are owned by private individuals, private businesses. There are very few industries that are owned by the government. For example, your postal service or your schools. Okay, they're technically also like businesses, but they're run by the government. If you go to other countries that also have capitalism, but they're maybe more on the socialistic side, for example, European nations, you'll find that some of their larger industries like media or healthcare, those kinds of things would be run by the government. And then the more you move towards socialism, the more government ownership you'll see and less private ownership. For example, in nations like Mexico or Cuba, which is a communist nation, you'll find things like the petroleum industry being owned by the government. Okay, so the person that came up with this whole idea of capitalism and market systems, and especially this idea of self-interest being the guiding principle behind everything, is a British scholar named Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote a book. It's actually, they call it a treatise. It was a huge volume. It started off as one book, but eventually got expanded to multiple volumes. But it's called The Wealth of Nations, back in 1776. He's actually credited as being the father of modern economics. And it is probably the most boring book. It's probably more boring than my lecture right now. There are actual audiobooks of The Wealth of Nations that I tried to listen to, which was absolutely unbearable. But anyway, The Wealth of Nations describes all the basic principles of today's modern capitalistic societies. Basically, in a nutshell, The Wealth of Nations talks about how everyone makes decisions based on self-interest, that we're all motivated by our own interests, that we're all basically greedy, and that we're looking to do what is best for ourselves. So like I mentioned earlier, there's a contradiction as far as the interests between the buyers and the sellers, the dynamics between the supply and demand. But that actually ends up working out. that competition that takes place between the buyers and sellers, or essentially here I wrote down the producers and consumers, that actually ends up it results in the best interests of society being met. There's no scientific explanation except to say that for some reason, when the two sides are looking out for themselves, everything always ends up working out the best for society. Here's an example of this whole idea of self-interest and everything kind of working out on its own. Adam Smith describes it as the invisible hand. Okay, the invisible hand, you can see, is defined like you see here. It's the best interests of a society usually are met when people compete to achieve individual self-interest. The invisible hand is basically Adam Smith's way of trying to explain something that was almost unexplainable. He couldn't really specifically explain why it worked, except that for some reason when people kind of look out for themselves and they compete for themselves, that things just always sort of balance out in the end and work out. You can see in this cartoon kind of the idea of the invisible hand. It's like this, if you guys can figure it out, this guy's trying to explain that the sales are taking place because of this invisible hand that is guiding and kind of controlling the economy. So here's what Adam Smith says about the invisible hand. He basically says we need to trust in the invisible hand, kind of like trust in a higher power. Just let things work out. And he really emphasized the idea that the less government involvement in the economy, that the less the government butts its nose into business, that's best for the economy. So like right now, the U.S. government, even though it is a capitalistic society, we have a lot of heavy government regulation and government involvement in business and the economy. There are lots of laws in place in the economy. Businesses have to abide by lots of regulations. And the government also gets involved when they, for example, when the recession began 4 years ago, the government injected a lot of government money with bailouts. Those are all examples of the government getting involved in the economy. So Adam Smith would look at how we do things and would say that we're doing the wrong thing. However, the invisible hand isn't always correct. And again, Adam Smith is the very first. He's like the father of modern economics. So a lot of things have changed since his original ideas. But his original idea is to basically say that the government needs to not get involved and to just essentially trust in the invisible hand and to allow things to work out. When the Great Depression began, President Hoover believed in this idea, and basically the idea was known as laissez-faire. Okay, it's a French term, basically means let them do as they please. A lot of times we describe this idea as laissez-faire capitalism. So it's capitalism where you have no government involvement. So President Hoover, originally when the Depression hit, he believed in this idea, and so what he did was he allowed for nothing to happen by the government, and he allowed for the people to kind of just flounder, hoping and expecting that the people would sort of work things out on their own, and that in time the economy would bounce back up. Unfortunately, his idea didn't work out, and eventually he had to change, and he decided to implement a lot of government programs, for example, like when he decided to build the Hoover Dam. The problem was for him that he had waited a little bit too long to implement some of those ideas, and that was why he eventually was voted out of office. And when President Roosevelt took over, he took the very opposite approach of laissez-faire capitalism, and rather than allowing the people to kind of just linger around and hope that the economy would just fix itself on its own without the government's help, Roosevelt did the complete opposite, took control of the economy, basically turned the United States into a socialist nation for during that time period, and by doing that he improved things, but really The only thing that brought us out of the Great Depression was World War II. So, in today, when we look at history, we really don't have any solid examples of laissez-faire working perfectly at the same time when the government takes control with democratic government planning. There's no proof that that actually works as well. But basically, again, laissez-faire means no government, absolutely no government involvement in the economy. So, to sum up the invisible hand, essentially, the economy is supposed to be self-regulating, meaning it doesn't need the outside, it doesn't need the government to do things. Because basically, when there's self-interest and competition and the invisible hand all taking place, the economy will regulate itself on its own. So when we have recessions are considered normal cycles, and that in the end, the economy will sort of like fix itself, and it will end the recession, and it will just sort of balance itself out on its own. Okay, a few characteristics of market systems. And these are the mandatory requirements to be considered a market system. First, you must have private property. What that basically means is that individuals and businesses must be owned by, businesses must be owned by private groups or individuals. So we're also talking about your resources, your key industries, things like that. There also has to be a freedom of exchange, and what that means is there has to be the freedom for people to meet at a market and for buyers and sellers to exchange their goods and services and their money freely without any kind of limits placed on them. There has to be the idea of competition, meaning that there needs to be lots of buyers, there needs to be lots of sellers, and then competition will take place. For example, buyers can shop around for the best price for a particular product. If you want to buy shoes, you can go to multiple different stores. There are multiple stores offering a variety of shoe styles and sizes and designs and colors and brand names, and so it allows you as a buyer to go shop around for the best possible bargain, whereas at the same time the sellers are competing against each other to try to make sure that you go to their store to buy their product. So there has to be some form of competition taking place in a market system. There also needs to be a profit motive, basically the desire to make money. The sellers have to be motivated to make money. Okay, now what I'm going to do is go back to Adam Smith here, and I'm going to show you guys a video. Now, it is a little boring. It's probably worse than my lecture here. I hope you guys are not sleeping. But anyways, it's the best I can do here. I'm going to show you a short video clip. It's going to last about 15 minutes. And after that, that'll conclude the lesson.
In 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, a highly original and groundbreaking economic treatise. The very first words of this work were nothing short of revolutionary.
The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all the necessaries and conveniences of life which it annually consumes, and which consist always either in the immediate produce of that labor or in what is purchased with that produce from other nations.
For the first time in the history of political and economic thinking, labor was defined as a nation's source of wealth. This concept would provide the inspiration for Karl Marx's socialist ideas, and also laid the intellectual groundwork for liberalism, upon which the capitalist economies of subsequent centuries would be built. Adam Smith was born in 1723 in Kirkcaldy, a small town in the south of Scotland. In Kirkcaldy there was no industrial activity, with the sole exception of a modest pin factory. As a teenager, Smith became curious about what went on in the workshop. 30 years later, it would become his model in The Wealth of Nations, and the most famous factory in the history of economics. In 1737, Smith entered the University of Glasgow. He then attended Balliol College in Oxford, where he majored in philosophy. Economics was considered at that time to be a branch of philosophy. In 1748, he returned to Scotland to work as a teacher of rhetoric and literature in Edinburgh. There he became a close friend of the empiricist philosopher David Hume, a relationship that would greatly influence his subsequent thought. A prodigious intellect in his own right, Hume passed on to Smith his notion of a natural morality based on a combination of selfish and altruistic behaviors. Adam Smith lived at a time of significant political and economic change. The Western world was leaving the age of feudal lords and merchants and entering the era of industrial capitalism. Smith would be a major prophet of this remarkable transformation. Two economic trends dominated the European scene of the time: mercantilism and physiocracy. Since the 15th century, mercantilism had dominated European economic politics. The mercantilist doctrine stated that a nation's wealth was determined by the amount of gold and silver it possessed. The state's role was to ensure that wealth stayed within the country, and to this end promulgated laws of commerce, set customs tariffs, and restricted imports. The state also granted monopoly patents to individuals and companies that would commercialize various products. In the middle of the 18th century, mercantilism was on the wane. A new rising class, the industrial bourgeoisie, was ousting the merchants from power. In France, the great bourgeois revolution was already gathering force. It was there that the first true economic theory appeared, physiocracy. Physiocracy was an economic and political doctrine based on the principles of natural law. Key components of the doctrine were the importance of land and landowners, as well as the freedom to buy and sell. Contrary to the mercantilists, physiocrats thought that the best kind of government was one that let events resolve themselves. Their slogan was, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Let it be, let it happen. In 1765, Adam Smith met two of the most important physiocrats, François Quesnay and Anne-Robert Turgot. This meeting would mark the beginning of Smith's interest in economics, which was just beginning to evolve as its own discipline. Smith came to acknowledge the value of the physiocrat's economic theory and even adopt, to a large extent, the principles of laissez-faire economics. In England and the south of Scotland, which had been joined under one kingdom since 1707, the situation was quite different than in France. These were the first days of the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine, invented by James Watt, a personal friend of Adam Smith's, was the crucial first step. Soon, factories with complex steam-powered machinery were being built and railway tracks were being laid. Thousands of people moved from the countryside to the cities to become workers. The merchant would soon be replaced by a new and more powerful player on the scene, the industrialist. For 17 years, Adam Smith had taken notes on the economic issues of his day, notes that he would bring together in The Wealth of Nations. In 1766, he returned to Scotland, determined to write his great work, but it took him 10 years to complete it. On March 9, 1776, the book that would revolutionize political economy was published. Divided into 5 parts, The Wealth of Nations is a wide-ranging treatise on economics, politics, and other topics. In its pages, Smith gave his assessment of the customs and institutions of his times. His intention in The Wealth of Nations was to reveal the true nature of the economic system. His conclusion was that economics are determined by an individual's personal interests.
It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we inspect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages.
Smith stated that, whether intentional or not, an individual's personal interest naturally resulted in furthering the common good.
By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention.
The invisible hand that guided individuals towards the common good would become the most famous metaphor in the history of economics, and the slogan of liberalism. Smith did not live to see sprawling factories with thousands of workers and massive machines. One aspect of the emerging industrial revolution that surprised him was the division of labor. Unlike the craftsmen of old, each factory worker focused his energies on one particular aspect of the overall process.
The division of labor, however, so far as it can be introduced, occasions in every art a proportional increase of the productive powers of labor.
The division of labor, also known as specialization, enhanced the individual worker's performance, what we would refer to today as productivity. In the worldview of industrialization, society is one immense system of cooperation. As a result, a nation's source of wealth is to be found in the division of labor, and the citizenry's degree of specialization was a key indicator of this wealth. In The Wealth of Nations...
Okay, I'm going to spare you guys from the rest of this video because as bad as it is, I actually have to endure through this as well. So, that's enough of that. I can't take this video. Sorry. Every year I try to show it and I cannot get through the video. So, we'll stop there. Alright, thank you guys for hopefully paying attention. I know some of you guys are asleep, but hopefully I will be back tomorrow. And if you guys have any questions, reserve those questions for me for tomorrow. Okay? Thank you, and I will see you later.